The primary purpose of any government, and especially the United States government, is supposed to be a couple of major things categorically. Keep the population safe and keep them within the ability to have economic prosperity. I mean, that's pretty straightforward, right? The government's supposed to keep you safe and to give you a chance to make a living. I mean, those are the main issues that we have from any government, and so it should be self-evident that that's the policies that they're going to do. You may disagree with them from time to time that this policy would be better than that policy, and that's why you have some of the political parties and all that kind of thing. But generally speaking, you still understand that that's what they're doing. But what happens when evidence is presented that shows maybe they're not doing that? Now, whether it's intentional or whether it's just incapacity, who can say? But we have a lot of evidence that our government right now is putting us at greater risk, and especially in our diplomats and our senior officials, putting us at greater risk of stumbling into wars instead of getting us out of them and keeping us safe. And there is no better person to break this down than with Professor John Mearsheimer, international relations theorist extraordinaire and political science professor at the University of Chicago, one of the favorites on our channel. John, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be here, Danny.
It's probably like a little bit of red meat to a bull or something to say, that what we're doing internationally is not making any sense to somebody with your reputation and credibility. But we have to address it here. And even before we get into some of the specifics here, my primary worry is that in both the Europe and in the Middle East is that our policies are taking problematic and difficult and chaotic situations, and instead of doing anything to make them better in either case, we seem to be doing the exact opposite. How do you see it?
Yeah, I think that if you look at the Gaza war and you look at the Ukraine war, and by the way, we're putting aside the potential for conflict in the East China Sea, which is quite significant these days. But if you look at Ukraine and you look at Gaza, it's quite clear that we have been in a lot of trouble in Ukraine since February 2022 when the war started, and in Gaza since that conflict started last October 7th. But when you think about sort of where we are today compared to where we were when both of those conflicts started, it seems quite clear that the situation has worsened, and the potential for escalation in both cases is quite significant. Moreover, there's no evidence that either one of these conflicts, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Ukraine-Russia conflict, both of which we're deeply involved in, are going to settle down anytime soon. And indeed, it looks like they're going to get worse over time. And that's why I think, in good part, the potential for escalation is so great in both cases.
Well, let's look first at the Russia-Ukraine war, since that's the one that really has the biggest potential negative ramifications. And so, I mean, really, you hit it on the head there when you look at the condition that existed on, say, January 2022 and the one that exists now in that area. By every measure, we are significantly worse off than we were before, whether you're talking about the casualties on the Ukraine side, the loss of their territory, the diminution of our own infrastructure and the number of weapons and ammunitions that we have to defend ourselves, and then the increase in the Russian capacity, the larger of their armed forces size, their industrial capacity, all of those things. And we could do a lot more. They're a lot worse. But then you have the Secretary of State of the United States saying that, yeah, I know about all those things, but actually our stuff is doing remarkably well.
The bottom line is this. The Ukraine strategy that we've had and that we've been acting on individually and collectively now for nearly 2.5 years is showing effective results in making sure that Ukraine can ward off Russian aggression, and it's done that remarkably. Keep in mind, Putin's objective from day one was to erase Ukraine from the map, to end its existence as an independent country, to subsume it into Russia. That has failed.
Now, in large measure there, John, I think that there's not a misstatement but an outright lie when he says that Putin's original objective was to take all of Ukraine and to wipe it off the map. So since there still is a Ukraine on the map, then hence he can say our strategy has worked remarkably well.
Well, it's not a lie if what he is saying is delusional. In other words, if he really believes this, then it's not a lie. It's just delusional. And I think that Tony Blinken, on a number of key dimensions of both the Ukraine conflict and the Gaza conflict, is not lying. He's just delusional. And in a very important way, that's probably worse than lying. But the fact is that Putin was never interested in conquering all of Ukraine. There's no evidence to support that assertion. But more importantly, given where we are today, his comment that Ukraine is doing quite well on the battlefield and it, in effect, has stymied the Russians is simply wrong. If you look at what's happening on the battlefield and even deeper into Ukraine in terms of the military conflict, the Russians are clobbering the Ukrainians. They're killing huge numbers of Ukrainian soldiers up on the front lines. They're making slow progress on the ground for sure in terms of capturing territory. But as you and I both know, that's not what really matters here. What matters is the casualty exchange ratio. And the casualty exchange ratio decisively favors the Russians at this point in time, who have more manpower to begin with. Furthermore, when you look at what the Russians are doing with their air power, the amount of destruction that they're creating with regard to, for example, the Ukrainian energy grid, it's quite stunning. They've brought down enough of that grid that half of Ukraine's electricity is no more. And in many places in Ukraine, they are not getting any electricity for 10 hours a day. And if anything, this situation is going to deteriorate in the months ahead as the Russians continue to target the grid. And then when the fall and especially the winter come, it's going to be really horrible for the Ukrainian population. And by the way, when you bring down the grid, it not only does immense damage to the civilian population, it has all sorts of consequences for your industry and for your military. So the idea that Ukraine is doing well and we're helping them to stabilize the situation is delusional. It's just another example of Tony Blinken and the Biden administration more generally making comments that make no sense. Ukraine is in deep trouble and we are in deep trouble.
Now, and let's look at some of that a little bit further. The U.S., one would, again, just conceptually believe that the State Department and the administration would be saying, okay, get in their little think tank room there and say, what can we do to lower the risk of this war escalating, to lower the risk of that anything bad happens to us, and maybe get this off the table so that we can start the process of rebuilding and rebuilding strength and rebuilding our own inventories. That would seem like what would be job number one. But instead, we don't see any of that so far. We see just delusions or whatever. They keep saying stuff like this and then no change on our policies. How can that be? And if you have any idea at all what might be going on in their minds that they think that this somehow could lead to something good, I just don't see it. Do you?
Well, the truth is we, meaning the West, and especially the United States, are committed to doubling down. And you saw this at the recent G7 meeting that took place in Italy in mid-June. What we did, and again, I'm talking about the West, but mainly the United States, was we reinforced our commitment to Ukraine. We supplied them with $50 billion. We increased the sanctions on Russia. And very importantly, the United States consummated a 10-year security agreement with Ukraine. And both Zelensky, President Zelensky of Ukraine, and Secretary of State Blinken said that this was, quote unquote, a bridge to bringing Ukraine into NATO. From a Russian point of view, this is, completely unacceptable. It's like waving a red flag in front of a bull, as we used to say when I was a kid. It's just asking for trouble. So all this is to say, Danny, that we are doubling down on our commitment to Ukraine. We are more invested than ever. And at the same time, the situation on the battlefield, the situation on the Ukrainian side of this conflict is deteriorating at a rapid pace. And that means there's going to be, at some point, significant pressure on the United States and on the West more generally to escalate, to rescue the situation, given that we are so profoundly committed to Ukraine's plight. So
Well,
this
and
is a
in
very
fact,
worrisome situation.
And in fact, that's exactly, we see the manifestation of that again on the ground here over the weekend. Well, actually, let me back up a little bit more. A month or so ago, Biden apparently first secretly gave permission to the Ukraine side to start using American weapons on Russian territory. And then over the weekend, one of those weapons either malfunctioned, was partly shot down, or was actually targeted, who can say, on Russian civilians on the beach at Sevastopol. Now, in the immediate aftermath, the U.S. ambassador was summoned to the Kremlin to give very stern representations and threats that Russia is going to react to it. And when the State Department official was asked about what happened, here's what Matt Miller had to say.
I've seen the comments from the government of Moscow. I think they pertain to the reported strike in Crimea. I will just tell you what the ambassador said when she met with the Russian Foreign Ministry, and that is, of course, that we lament any civilian loss of life in this war. We provide weapons to Ukraine so it can defend its sovereign territory against armed aggression. That includes in Crimea, which of course is part of Ukraine. And Russia could stop this war today and end the suffering caused by the war Russia launched today if it would stop its occupation of sovereign Ukrainian territory and stop launching attacks on civilians.
So in that right there, he literally expressed no genuine sorrow for the civilians who were killed on that, just kind of this categorical, well, we don't like civilians getting hit. No worries about that. No comment at all. The fact that it was a U.S. weapon reportedly that caused it. And I think the key thing is there no comment at all that there's going to be any changes in the policy. We're going to keep doing it.
Well, the thing is, Danny, I think we have said all along that the Ukrainians can use the ATACMS missiles inside of what used to be all of Ukraine before before 2014. Okay, 2014 is when the Russians took Crimea. So we have long said that using ATACMS against Crimea, and that's where this attack this past Sunday took place, is acceptable. And the administration has now said, this is the Biden administration, has now said that they can use ATACMS to attack Ukrainian forces right across the Russia-Ukraine border. So that's a very important threshold that we've crossed there. We're saying that the Ukrainians can use the ATACMS as long as it's just across the Russo-Ukrainian border. The really key issue here is whether at some point we give the Ukrainians the green light to use the ATACMS for deep strikes into Russian territory. And if we do that, that will be a truly serious escalation. The Russians have not retaliated given the limited strikes into the Russian territory that lies just on the other side of the Ukrainian border. And the attacks in Crimea, the only reason they have caused such a kerfuffle is because civilians were killed. And so you have to be very careful to discriminate between the different kinds of attacks with these ATACMS missiles, which are clearly American supplied weapons.
Yeah, and we saw immediately aftermath that Dmitry Peskov here, the Kremlin spokesman, as well as the I saw earlier, well, it was actually yesterday, so I saw it today, that the UN ambassador to Russia in the UN also expressly said that there will be consequences. The foreign ministry issued a statement saying that there will be consequences. Apparently, that's what was communicated to our ambassador when she was summoned there. So what do you, first of all, how do you think that, what is the range of possibilities of what Russia could do? And then, of course, the possibility of what would we do in retaliation to that?
I would just preface my comments by saying that it's important to understand that there is a lot of criticism inside of Russia of Vladimir Putin for not being tough enough in terms of waging this war. So there is pressure on him to counterattack, to go back at the United States for what happened, from all sorts of people, respected people in the Russian blogosphere, and also a number of established figures in the Russian foreign policy elite. Putin has really not, as I like to say, turned the dogs loose yet. And there are a number of people who would like to do that. And at some point, he may be forced to do that. It's hard to say exactly what he will do in terms of retaliation. The way I think of this, Danny, is you never want to lose sight of what your principal goal is when you wage a war. And your principal goal here is to defeat the Ukrainians on the battlefield and to get some sort of peace settlement that you find satisfactory. And at the same time, if you're the Russians, you want to avoid escalation. You do not want to end up in a war with NATO, and you especially don't want to end up in a war with the United States. So you have to be very careful that you pursue the right policy so that you can achieve both of those goals. And I think that given the way Putin has waged the war, they are doing very well on the battlefield, and they have done an excellent job from a Russian perspective of not causing escalation, despite the fact that it's clear that the Ukrainians would like to drag NATO and especially the Americans into the fight. There's no question about that, and we have to be aware of that all the time. Zelensky wants us to come into the fight. And again, the Russians don't want us to come into the fight. And the Russians are doing very well on the battlefield. So I think if they do retaliate, it will be a measured retaliation. They may shoot down some drones of ours out over the Black Sea or something like that. They may go after some Western targets inside of Ukraine in ways they haven't in the past. But I think it will be a limited response, in large part because it would not make sense to do anything that would possibly bring NATO into the fight.
Gary, do we have that clip from Jack Keane talking about he wants to? He said, okay, I want to show you something here because this is something that there is pressure on the United States from a lot of the regular suspects about people who want to push more and more into Russia, that they want to defeat Russia, et cetera. And here is Jack Keane a few days back saying that, yeah, I heard that, the Biden said that they could attack along this, I think, a 75-kilometer front, but it should go much more than that. And here's what he showed on a map.
The administration isn't coming clean about what's actually happening here. You see that bright red area there across from Ukraine? That is where we can fire HIMARS, or what they call guided multiple rocket launchers, into that. That's 75 kilometers into that. But see all the gray area outside of that? That's the Russian sanctuary where we cannot fire. That's all Russian territory. All the air bases that Russia is using to bomb Ukraine are largely in that area. Those are those little white circles there. Their ground bases, their logistic bases are all in that area. And the administration has told Ukraine they cannot fire the weapons that we've given them. That is absolutely makes no sense. And it's really handcuffing them in their ability to protect their own people, but also in their ability to bring down the military capability that Russia has. Ukraine, we can turn the tide in their favor, and the administration has got to stop handicapping them.
And first of all, do you see any prospect that firing a bunch more ATACMS could turn the tide and make the military capability of the Russian side collapse if we expanded the zone?
Not at all. I mean, I think he's simply wrong. He's a war hawk par excellence, and he understands full well that the Ukrainians are losing. And he's desperate to find some sort of magic way to fix this problem and to help the Ukrainians win. And he thinks that using ATACMS for long distance strikes into the Russian homeland is going to fix the problem on the battlefield. There's no reason to think that that's going to happen. I think it's going to have hardly any effect, if any effect, on what happens on the battlefield. And we could get into why that's the case. But this is just evidence of the pressure that's going to be brought to bear on the Biden administration to up the ante as the Ukrainians continue to lose on the battlefield. And if we up the ante, if we do what Keane wants to do, the question you have to ask yourself is, what are the Russians going to do? And at some point, the Russians are going to retaliate in a really big way. As I said, I don't think they're going to retaliate in a really big way because of what happened this past Sunday with the attack on the people on the beach in Sevastopol. I think the Russian response will be limited. But I think once you begin to pound away at the Russian homeland, deep into the Russian homeland, the Russians are going to feel compelled to respond in a big way. And then the question, what are we going to do? And then the question after that is, what are the Russians going to do? And
well, that's the whole issue there.
That escalation ladder.
Right. That's exactly the thing that concerns me, and why the actions of our leaders concern me as well. Because it's almost like we don't have we don't have a vision for what we want to accomplish. You mentioned at the outset that Putin is very clearly driven by his objective, what he wants to accomplish. We don't have a commensurate view on our side of this issue, because you see that while Biden is on the one hand throwing, allowing some of our weapons to be used, then in these pinprick things, number one, we don't have that many ATACMS missiles. Not many people realize that, but we have a very limited store of them. So it's not like we can just turn them on and let Ukraine use a bunch of them. But then combined with that, also you have from the American leadership very mixed signals, because we had this just a week or so ago from Jake Sullivan.
President Zelensky has made clear, including here in Switzerland, that ultimately this war will have to be determined at the negotiating table. The United States' goal has been to put Ukraine in as strong as possible a position on the battlefield, so it is in as strong a position as possible at the negotiating table. It's up to Ukraine to decide when and how that occurs. Its strength at the negotiating table will be improved by what's happened here in Switzerland, because you have more than 100 countries and international organizations coming together to lay a foundation for a just peace built on a simple proposition. You cannot take territory by force. It says that in the United Nations Charter. It's at the core of international law. Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity has to be respected.
So which is it, John? Are we trying to do what John Kirby said on, I think it was the 7th of June, that Biden wants to go back to the 1991 borders? He supports that. Or is the policy that actually we're just trying to get them into a good negotiating position so they can negotiate from strength? And which is it? What are we trying to do?
Well, I think that the key people in the administration are sophisticated enough to understand that going back to the 1991 borders or even the 2022 borders is not going to happen. And I think the best they hope for at this point is what Sullivan described, which is to basically stymie the Russian offensive, force the Russians to come to the negotiating table, and get the best possible deal for Ukraine. And that's the justification all sorts of people, not just Sullivan, but people outside the administration use for continuing to support Ukraine, for doing what we did at the G7 meeting. But they're dead wrong, because what's going to happen here is, if the war continues, which is what will happen given Sullivan's policies, if the war continues, Ukraine is going to lose more territory, more people are going to be killed, and furthermore, the Russians are going to have an even greater incentive to wreck what's left of Ukraine, to have a truly dysfunctional rump state. So Sullivan's strategy only works if we can give the Ukrainians the military wherewithal to stymie the situation on the battlefield. We can't do that. The Russians are on a roll. They're pounding the Ukrainians. That means the Ukrainians moving forward are going to get a worse deal than they'll get today if they were to go to the negotiating table.
Right. And of course, we've seen Vladimir Putin came out right before that Swiss conference and actually put a genuine, legitimate offer for a negotiated settlement that has harsh terms for Ukraine. But as you said, and just did there very eloquently, it's going to be worse if we wait till later. But here's an additional level of the problem. Even if what Sullivan said was actually true, and of course it's contradicted by other statements by other American leaders, they're about to try and have a big happy dance and a celebration here in Washington, D.C. in a couple of weeks on the 75th anniversary of NATO, where, according to what Blinken's been saying, we're going to announce either, if not an outright plan for accession to Ukraine into NATO, we're certainly going to talk like we're going down that path. And that runs completely contrary to having a negotiated settlement, because Russia will never, under any circumstances, allow that to be an end state.
I agree completely. I mean, we're really good at happy talk, and I'm sure they'll have this big celebration in Washington, and there'll be all sorts of hints about Ukraine coming into NATO and how deeply invested the West is in Ukraine's security. But I don't believe, Danny, that they're going to make any substantive move to bring Ukraine into NATO. This is just not going to happen. Stoltenberg spilled the beans when he said about a week and a half ago that for Ukraine to get into NATO, it had to first defeat the Russians inside of Ukraine. And as you and I both know, the Russians are not going to be defeated inside of Ukraine. Ukraine is not going to win this war. And the end result is Ukraine is never going to become a member of NATO.
But so now here's my concern, going back to what you said a second ago, is that there are multiple pressures on Vladimir Putin. He has his objective that he wants, which is to basically defeat Ukraine, have a neutral Ukraine in between him and NATO, and some kind of prospect that they can have a peaceful coexistence with the West. But he's also under pressure by some of the hardliners, and actually many people in Russia, especially after this Sevastopol strike, which is such an emotional deal, combined with other terrorist actions that happened on the same day. They want some kind of a response. And depending on what he chooses to do here, I mean, it seems like at some point that he may be willing to do something stronger, or may have to do something, or at least be under pressure for it. That's my worry about the escalation potential and our policies, which don't seem to be doing anything to bring it to an end. What do you see as the risk that this has some kind of an escalatory ladder process that could end up bad for our side?
Well, as I said, I don't think that'll happen, but let's assume that I'm wrong and what you're saying proves to be correct. I mean, let's say that the Russians were to target, a weapons depot in the eastern part of Poland or in the eastern part of Romania, to actually up the ante in a really serious way. The question you have to ask yourself is, what are we going to do? And I don't think there's much we can do. What are we going to do? Launch American missiles at the Russian homeland? We're not talking about HIMARS here or ATACMS. We're talking about, missiles, based in Western Europe or based on submarines or flown by American aircraft. Are we going to do that? I don't think so. So I think if you go up the escalation ladder, as a lot of people want to do. I mean, this is getting back to General Keene's comments. He, like many superhawks in the United States, relish the idea of going up the escalation ladder because they think that we will dominate the Russians. I don't think you can tell a plausible story about how we win going up the escalation ladder. And when you take into account that that escalation ladder has nuclear weapons on certain rungs, you're playing with fire. And who's ever in the White House is at some point going to back off very quickly for fear that that person is going to get us all incinerated.
Well, one would hope that that'd be the thought. But, I mean, I look at what happens when we've had, strikes against our people in the Middle East. We immediately take, whether it's striking back in Syria or whatever. And if Russia does anything, if they make good on anything and an American or American interest is harmed, you're certainly going to have lots of pressure, just like Putin has from his right. You're going to have pressure on Biden from his side, like the keen warhawks, to do something to respond to that. Because I just can't. It's hard for me to imagine an American leader having a Russian do something and hit somebody and go, well, I mean, we had that coming. It's a tit for tat, so that's the tat. So let's just let it go, which I think we should. But I worry a lot about trying to just one up a little bit more on the Russians.
I do too. I mean, I'm not arguing for 1 second that there's no danger here once you go up the escalation ladder. As I've said on many occasions, we fortunately have no experience with a major conventional war between two great powers armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. So we're not exactly sure what the escalation dynamics look like. And if one nuclear weapon was used, how that then leads to further nuclear escalation and where it all ends up is very hard to say, in large part because, again, we have thankfully never had a nuclear war between two nuclear armed great powers. So we're out there in virgin territory and nobody knows for sure how this will play itself out. But that gives both sides very powerful incentives to stay off the escalation ladder. And if they get on the escalation ladder, not to go up very quickly. Your point is that that may sound nice in theory, John, but in practice, you want to understand that these political leaders on both sides, both the Russian side and the American side, will be under tremendous pressure to escalate. And therefore, there's a good chance that they'll do something stupid. I tend, and I want to underline the word tend, to think you're wrong, but you may be right. And if you are, we are in really deep trouble.
Well, I really hope you're right. There's never been a time I want to be more wrong than on something like this. I'm going to shift over with the amount of time we have left to what we're doing in the Middle East, because unfortunately this is not the only area we got a problem. And as you said, we don't even have time to talk about the Indo-Pacific, which has its own issues that we could talk about. But what do you think that the U.S. could do, and what would you do if you were advising the president on given the messy situation, all the dynamics and everything that exists we talked about, all the reality, what could we do to start to de-escalate this and bring it into a point to where it could actually be resolved, where somehow everybody saves face, probably except for the Ukrainians, because there's not going to be a good way out for them. But what would you recommend?
Just very quickly, let me note that we are basically involved in a war, very low-level war with the Houthis in the Red Sea, and we're not doing very well there. And you also want to remember that we fought against the Iranians on April 14th, when Iran attacked Israel on April 14th in retaliation for the Israeli attack on the Iranian embassy in Damascus on April 1st. On that April 14th day, we were involved in the fight against Iran. So it's very important to understand we've been involved on 2 occasions in fighting in the Middle East. And what we worry about is getting sucked into a war with Hezbollah. And we also worry about getting involved in a major war with the Iranians. The Minister of Defense in Israel, Yoav Gallant, has been in Washington over the past few days, and he's been putting pressure on the Americans to deal with the Iranian nuclear issue. And by and large, that means using American military force, maybe in conjunction with Israeli military force to quote unquote solve that problem. So the pressure here for us to do something militarily with Iran is going to grow with the passage of time. And there's a danger we'll get sucked into this war with Hezbollah. And we're already in a fight with the Houthis. So you then ask the question, which of course is the appropriate one, is what we can do to avoid a war with Iran, to avoid a war with Hezbollah, to shut down the war with the Houthis, and to shut down the war with Hamas. My view is that there's only one way to solve this problem, and that's to get the Israelis to fundamentally alter their foreign policy, because it is the war in Gaza, the Hamas-Israel war in Gaza, that is the taproot of all these problems, except for the Iran nuclear problem. And if you want to avoid a war with Hezbollah, and you want to shut down the war with the Houthis, and you want to shut down the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, you have to figure out how to solve the problem in Gaza and the West Bank, by the way. And that involves us getting involved and putting pressure on the Israelis to change their policies towards the Palestinians, which are, of course, remarkably foolish, and adopt a smart policy. But the fact is, Danny, we cannot do that. We cannot put any meaningful pressure on the Israelis, in large part because of the power of the Israel lobby in the United States. All of this is a way of saying we're screwed.
Well, okay. All right. Well, that's a pretty simple way to put it. It's just as if to underscore your point there, in terms of changing Israelis' policies. We'll start with the taproot on Hamas. Here's Netanyahu a few days back talking about how he plans to actually cut the grass.
של המלחמה בחמאס עומד להסתיים. זה עומד להסתיים. זה לא אומר שהמלחמה עומדת להסתיים, אבל המלחמה בשלב העצים שלה עומדת להסתיים ברפיח, זה נכון. אנחנו נמשיך אחר כך בכיסוח הדשא, לא נוותר להם. אגב, אתם רואים את זה.
So he says the first intensive phase is going to be over, but then he's just going to mow the grass. And for anybody who doesn't know what he means by that, is that they mean that they'll just keep on whacking the Palestinians periodically every time they pop up, almost like a whack-a-mole. And basically that will just continue on without any hesitation or pause.
Yeah, you want to understand, this is very important, that when the fighting first broke out after October 7th between the IDF and Hamas, that Prime Minister Netanyahu said unequivocally that they were going to decisively defeat Hamas. This was the end of Hamas. That has not happened. Hamas is still in the fight. There's no evidence it's going to disappear from the fight. And it's still a potent military force. And there's no way the Israelis are going to defeat Hamas. What this tells you is that the problem in Gaza that led to what happened on October 7th has not gone away. And the Israelis are going to continue to use military force. They're going to continue to mow the grass as a way of dealing with this problem. This means that not only the Israelis, but we, the United States, have no way of getting out of this terrible situation.
Sorry about that. Gave me a little start there. But well, here's the problem. I mean, if it was only that, it would be a big problem because, basically you're saying a forever war, and that we're going to have to continue giving all of our ammunition and weapon systems and whatnot to continue this going on. But as Netanyahu continued in that same interview, he's not content with just mowing that grass.
ומכים בהם בעוצמה. אבל אחרי סיום השלב העצים, תהיה לנו אפשרות להעתיק חלק מהכוח צפונה. ואנחנו נעשה את זה. קודם כל למטרות הגנה, ושנית, כדי להחזיר גם, אם נוכל, נעשה את זה בדרך מדינית, אם לא, נעשה את זה בדרך.
And I'm sorry, I actually meant to read that because I know the words are really small in there. But what he's saying there, for those who weren't able to read it, is that he's going to continue to put pressure, and then he's going to move his troops to the north and solve that diplomatically if possible, and then solve it in another way if not possible. Ergo, he's getting ready to go into Lebanon.
I mean, this is really crazy. They have not won the war against Hamas. The Israeli military is exhausted. They're having significant problems with regard to calling up reservists for a second and third time. There are all sorts of articles in places like the Jerusalem Post that talk about problems the commanders are having getting reservists to appear for their second and third tour in Gaza. This is an army that has been stretched thin in Gaza and is in a lot of ways at the end of its rope. And again, they haven't won in Gaza. So now you're telling me that they're going to take this army and they're going to invade southern Lebanon and they're going to defeat Hezbollah and put an end to the problems up in the north of Israel. This is extremely unlikely. The Israelis went into Lebanon in 1982, and they went into Lebanon in 2006, and both were colossal failures. There's no plan that I see that tells me that the IDF has the capability to defeat and erase Hezbollah as a problem. Hezbollah is a much more formidable fighting force than Hamas. And again, they have not defeated Hamas, and they have exhausted the IDF in the process. They're now going to go into southern Lebanon and win up there. I don't think that that's a plausible argument.
Well, but here's the problem, John. Here's the problem with this: if it was again us trying to change Netanyahu's, focus or his objectives, whatever, that would be an almost an insurmountable problem. But as we're going to see here, it's actually the U.S. that seems to be encouraging this. Check this CNN piece out.
Last week, Israeli generals approved a plan to attack Lebanon, while Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah recently warned if it comes to war, the group will fight Israel on land, sea, and air, and also inside Israel itself.
People have heard here in Lebanon for months now sort of saber rattling coming from Israel. But I think what has people really worried was what we've heard reported on CNN, that the Biden administration has expressed its full support for Israel in the event of full-scale hostilities between Hezbollah and Israel, which is rather reminiscent of the full-bodied support the Americans voiced at the beginning of the disastrous war in Gaza.
So again, I mean, back to the concept of this whole episode here is that U.S. leadership is drawing us closer to escalation, not closer to a culmination of getting these wars done. Why in the world, given what you just said right before I showed that video, would we now want to say we're going to escalate and support and endorse moving into southern Lebanon? Because militarily, I could go spend half the show explaining why that's a disastrous, terrible idea. But you've already articulated that. But what are we doing at the national level, John?
Well, I think, Danny, that report was somewhat misleading. I think there is no question that the administration is doing all they can to discourage the IDF from going into Lebanon. We do not want Israel to attack Hezbollah. One of our great fears is that Iran will come in and we'll be in a major war with Iran. But even putting that aside, we do not want another war. The Gaza war is enough. We do not want a war involving Israel and Hezbollah that we might get dragged into. But what we have said, and I think this was foolish, but it was done for domestic politics reasons. We have said to people in the region that if Israel does get involved in a war with Hezbollah, we will back them. And of course, we will back them because we back Israel no matter what it does. That's the way this relationship works. Israel is the tail that wags the dog. There's no question about that. So when we said that, right, we were telling the truth. But the problem is we're in effect alerting the Israelis that even if they start a war and it doesn't look like a smart thing to do, we'll support them full scale no matter what, which of course we will. And Biden has to do that. And whoever was sitting in the White House would have to do that because the Israel lobby would leave that president, in this case, President Biden, no choice. But the end result is the Israelis are free to do reckless things like invade Lebanon. And given Netanyahu's track record at doing foolish things, this is very worrisome.
And I guess to underscore your point about the tail wagging the dog, was it a week or two ago, Netanyahu very publicly came out and blasted the administration, Blinken in particular, about how dare we withhold 2,000-pound bombs, and claimed that there was other things we were holding back, like it's almost like a Amazon warehouse that they ordered. And what do you mean? Where's my package? How come it hasn't gotten here? As though you don't have any kind of interest or of your own. And instead of really putting them in their place here was Blinken responding to it. And this sounds more like an apology than it does a retribution.
I'm not going to talk about what we said in diplomatic conversations. I can just say again that we have a commitment to make sure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself against a whole variety of threats. Gaza is part of it, but it far surpasses Gaza in terms of the threats they face. The president's committed to that. We continue to move these different cases through our system on regular order. We have one case that the president's talked about publicly about the 2,000-pound bombs and concerns that we have about them being used in densely populated areas. That remains. We continue to work through that, but there's been no change in our posture, which our posture is, again, to make sure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself across these many threats. Many of the systems that are moving through our system are ones that have been on order for, in some cases, years. It takes a long time to move these things. And a number of the things that are going to Israel won't get there for years. That is the nature of the way this works. But it's regular order, with the exception of that one system that we've talked about many times in public.
So there was no, any evidence at all of him saying, "Hey, we're going to do what we're going to do," and don't, just act like we're going to do whatever you want to. I mean, he was really just trying to wring his hands. Well, it wasn't that, and that just, in my view, didn't tell me what you think. This just tells Netanyahu, yes, you can do whatever you want, and there is nobody in Washington that's ever going to say no to you.
2 points. One is the sense of entitlement on Netanyahu's part is really quite stunning. Just listening to him talk, it's really quite amazing that he just feels that Israel is entitled to this weaponry, period. And the United States has no choice but to give him that weaponry. No sense that, he's dealing with a superpower here, that he's beholden to the United States in any way. Just a really profound sense of entitlement. And as an American, it bothers me enormously. But with regard to your comment, I think the fact is that Netanyahu understands full well that he can do pretty much anything he wants, and he will get all the aid he wants from the United States. He understands full well that the lobby is incredibly powerful in the United States, and no American politician is going to cross Israel in a meaningful way. No American politician is going to stand up for the American national interest if that president thinks the American national interest is at odds with Israel's national interest. The American president will do what Netanyahu wants. Netanyahu fully understands that. And that's why he treats us with contempt, because he understands that when it comes to Israel, American politicians or American leaders have zero backbone. And everything we've seen since October 7th, including Tony Blinken's performance a minute ago on your show, makes it clear that Netanyahu is right. He should treat the Americans with contempt because they are deserving of that contempt.
Wow. Really, I'm almost speechless. I have nothing to say at all to that. But here's the gist of this. All right. So we first talked about the Russia-Ukraine war and American leadership causing lots of those problems, or at least exacerbating it. Now then, we just talked about the stuff going on in the Middle East. Here's where these things mesh together, which causes even more alarm to escalation. Escalation in one area is bad, one area, the other area is also bad. But when they start kind of coalescing, then our flexibility gets worse. So first of all, you have in the Russia-Ukraine situation, United States saying we're going to change policies and openly allow Ukraine to use our weapons onto Russian territory. The Russian president says, okay, we're going to do a tit for tat, and now I'm not going to withhold from my ability the issue of giving weapons to your enemies, wherever they may be, state, non-state, who knows? We don't know what he's going to do. That's what he meant. He then went to North Korea, made a big deal, a military pact with them, mutual defense deal that has lots of issues for ammunition and weapons and whatnot. And then you have the possibility if Israel does launch a war and gets into one with Hezbollah, then there's the very real possibility that Iran gets involved, because I think it would be very unlikely that they're going to allow Hezbollah in the event that Israel started winning, that they're going to allow them to go down without getting involved themselves. And of course, then there's going to be real threat possibilities for the United States to also get involved. Lots of people are already saying we should do that in the United States. Then here's where the next rub comes into. Would Vladimir Putin make good on his threat before to arm Iran so that they can now do more to the U.S.-Israeli side? And then you see that this stuff just all gets mixed in together. And to me, now then the risk all across the board rises.
Yeah. Very interesting set of comments, Danny. Just to sort of build on what you said, if the Israelis go into Lebanon, that war is likely to spill over into Syria, as it has in the past, because Syria and Lebanon are neighbors. And you want to remember, the Russians are in Syria in a big way. And it could be the case that the Russians get involved with the Israelis in Syria. I'm not saying that's likely, but it is a possible outcome of a war between Israel and Hezbollah. Furthermore, if Iran gets involved in a war involving Hezbollah and Israel, that would be a huge problem for the United States, because we'd undoubtedly get sucked in at that point. And then the question is, what would the Russians do? The Russians would surely help the Iranians as well as the Syrians. So you see, the US-Russia competition is beginning to manifest itself, not simply in Eastern Europe, in a place like Ukraine, but here in the Middle East. Reminds you a lot of the Cold War, when the Americans and the Soviets, competed in the Cold War. And in fact, in 1973, I remember when American nuclear forces were put on alert during the Yom Kippur War, and people were fearing a US-Soviet conflict. So what you're seeing here is that the two scenarios that we worry about, the Ukraine scenario and the Gaza scenario, look like they're more and more interconnected. One final point on this, Danny, and that is the Iran nuclear issue. You want to remember that the Russians can give the Russians can give the Iranians all sorts of air defense missiles that could be used to protect their nuclear assets. And furthermore, the Russians can look the other way if the Iranians decide to go down the nuclear road. In the past, we have depended heavily on both the Russians and the Chinese, and of course the major European powers, to help us corral the Iranians when it comes to developing nuclear weapons. But if things get dicey enough between the Russians and the Americans, and even the Americans and the Chinese and the Russians may be willing to, in effect, protect the Iranians as they go down the nuclear road, not simply by giving them weapons to defend themselves, air defense weapons, but also by just protecting them diplomatically. So there are just lots of ways things can spin out of control moving forward.
Yeah. There's and obviously this is no prediction that any one of these things is going to happen, but it's to show that almost all the things that we've been talking about here are plausible, and a theme that undergirds all of them in very rickety supports is American leadership. Because, and I think you've said this before, with decisive American leadership, we could shut down the war in Israel. We could shut down the war in Hezbollah, in Russia and Ukraine. There's lots of things that we could do to bring those things to rapid conclusions. And we're doing nothing, even seeking diplomatic anything. We're just feeding them both and wondering what's going to happen next. That's what it looks like to me.
Yeah. Well, just to take each one, I think in the case of the Middle East, the case of the Gaza war, we're desperate to shut down the Gaza war, and we're desperate not to let it escalate to include a war against Hezbollah or a war involving Iran. But we have zero maneuver room in large part because of the Israel lobby here in the United States.
Well, we have no maneuver room because we're unwilling to use the leverage. I mean, it's a political choice, right?
Well, you can make that argument for sure, but whatever president crosses the lobby will pay an enormous price, as many politicians are finding out these days in the United States. No president's going to cross the lobby. And if you look at President Trump, he kowtows to the lobby every bit as much as President Biden does, and as their predecessors did, and that will be true, moving forward. So
until the kowtowing ends up getting us sucked into a war that we actually can't get out of, we pay a price. Then I bet there'll be a lot of willingness to stand up to that lobby if it hurts us. But I agree with you. I'm not arguing with you at all. I agree with what you described is absolutely almost ironclad. And I fear that because we won't have anybody willing to stand up and do what's right, no matter the political cost to them, we could end up in a war just because we're just letting the events take their course.
You're not going to get any disagreement from me on that. But then just to go over to the Ukraine war, it's actually a different situation there. There we're actually upping the ante on our own, as I described in my earlier comments. I mean, you and I both agree, if anything, what we should be doing is working overtime now to shut that war down, because we both believe that from a strategic point of view and a moral point of view, that's the best outcome for Ukraine, not to mention the United States and the West more generally. But we're doing the exact opposite. So we're behaving in remarkably foolish ways in Ukraine. I think, again, to go back to the Middle East, there we have our hands tied behind our back. I think we have a good sense of what needs to be done in the Middle East. We just can't do it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And man, it's just, you see the current administration, if they win the election this November, it's very likely that they'll just continue with the status quo going forward. And if Trump ends up winning, at least what he's been saying lately, he'll have a pretty dramatic change, at least in that one war. And then at least we can get one thing off our plate if we get in there, or, at least there's a possibility of it. But man, right now I just worry because I don't know who the President Trump would bring on his team that's going to be fundamentally better, especially in foreign policy and leadership level, to do the hard things that are necessary to keep us safe. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see how things play out.
Yeah, I think all the evidence is that Trump has the right instincts on Ukraine, that he understands it's time to cut a deal, and that would be best for Ukraine and best for the United States. But his forte is not the execution of foreign policy, as we know well. And it's not clear that he will bring in people who can execute that basic strategy that he has in mind. Furthermore, even if he brings in really smart people and they go to work in smart ways, the fact is there will be tremendous resistance. There are just a huge number of people, as we both know, who are committed to upping the ante against the Russians and in support of Ukraine and not ending this war. So I don't want to say that Trump will run into a brick wall, but he's going to run into a wall that's not going to be easy to plow through.
Yeah, that's for sure. We've seen that play out already once in several other areas, and I have no doubts that would be the case again. But I guess we'll just have to leave it there for now and wait and see what happens. Professor Mearsheimer, thank you so much for coming on today. It's always a delight and a pleasure to get to run through these issues with you, and thanks for sharing with us today.
It was my pleasure, Danny. I always enjoy talking about these issues, as depressing as the issues are, and they are mighty depressing.
They really are. Thank you very much. And we thank you guys for joining us today. Be sure, really, like and subscribe. Share this with everybody that you know, because, folks, as ugly and hard as this stuff is, it is the truth. You deserve to know the truth, and you're just not going to get it on any of the mainstream networks. That's why we have this show, but we count on you to be able to spread the word so that others can share the same amount of truth that you have. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.